Joseph being sold into slavery. We've gone through his years of imprisonment. We've gone through his elevation to essentially what you may think of as the prime minister or the vizier of Egypt. And of course, he has been, by interpreting Pharaoh's dream, and coming up with a plan, has preserved Egypt and is preserving even the surrounding countries when they come to Egypt for food through what is going to be 7 years of famine, so tremendously long famine. He has just been reunited with his brothers who originally sold him into slavery, and they were a little nervous about all that, but now he's going to be settling his family in the country of Goshen, which is to the north and west of where the capital would have been in Egypt. So that just to get us up to speed. So you'll just get the rhythm of how we do this. I literally I'll read it out so that we have lots of different translations around the table. That lets the people at home kind of keep up. And then we're just going to talk about what grabs all of our attention as we move forward. And that kind of becomes the jumping off point. So, chapter 47, verse 1. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "You have come to sojourn in the land. We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your flocks. For the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now, please, let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." So, what grabs your attention?
The fact that they're shepherds.
Yes. And chapter 46, we were informed by Joseph that the Egyptians don't like shepherds.
Shepherds.
They're kind of lower class, second class citizens. So it's not a status in life anyone in Egypt aspires to. And so here you get this sort of, and he predicts to his brothers, Pharaoh's going to sell you in Goshen. And it's unclear whether it's a prediction because the Lord's given him like a word of prophecy, or more like, he's really got control of the reins of power now. Literally, just about everything that happens with his approval. Like, I'm going to manage it, so we settle the family in Goshen. And the fact that they're coming as shepherds is a boon to Pharaoh, because he needs someone to do well with his flocks. Why? Because this is food, and they're in the middle of a famine, and yet no Egyptian wants the work. Okay. Not unlike some of what we're seeing in our own country with people coming in and taking jobs no one in America wants, right? This is what you see. And so he's very excited by this. This is actually something, and Joseph is selling it to Pharaoh in a very kind of casual way, like, what a great idea, settle my family in Goshen. That's pretty awesome. Yeah. Anything else?
Land would be at a premium in Egypt.
Yes.
Good land.
Yes.
And to be given the best land.
Yes. Absolutely. Now, Goshen is not on what we call the frontier. If you were looking at, I wish I had a map of Egypt. I've got the Holy Land, but I should.
I have one on the computer.
You have it on the computer? Yeah.
I just had it hooked up.
Well, what you can see probably over here on this one is, here's Egypt, here's Canaan. This little break right here between the tip of the Red Sea, and this is the land break across which the Assyrian Empire would need to come if they wanted to invade Egypt. So this is the defensible land. But Goshen is up here. You can see the way the Nile splits into many multiple parts here. Maybe I'll just take this down and pass it around. You'll see the delta that's created where the Nile flows in. And each year the Nile floods. Where is it? Over here. Each year the Nile floods and over its banks, and all that area gets very, very rich with sediment and with rotting, plant material and all kind of stuff, and that's what makes that such good farmland. And this is where Goshen is going to be up here. Okay, so pass that around if you want. Yes, but to give them the best land is really significant and is really something. And it shows the esteem in which he holds Joseph. Joseph is right now preserving the entire land from starvation. And so it's really, he's holding him up as a really important political figure here. This is also going to be the undoing of the Hebrews, though, because we're almost at the end of Genesis. And what's going to happen is they're going to just have this huge elapse of time before the book of Exodus starts. And what's happened in that time is that the Hebrews have gone, and their population has exploded. And by the time we get to the beginning of Exodus, the Pharaoh no longer, rather than trusting the Hebrews, he sees them as a potential threat. There are so many of them, and should the Assyrian army invade across that little land bridge, they may choose to join them and conquer Egypt rather than the other. And that's what he's nervous about. The reason why they explode in population is they've got good food. And child mortality is low compared to the rest of Egypt. So they're in, and probably they're actually living in healthier conditions. I mean, cities in the ancient world were not places that were clean. You were dealing with a lot of septic issues and all kinds of things. The Romans really, by inventing the public water system they created, really improved the health of their cities in tremendous ways. And so they're healthier because they're living essentially on the land rather than cities. Okay. All right. Let's continue on to verse 7. Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. And they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." Who's he referring to there? The years of the sojourning? And who's he referring to? Huh?
Abraham.
Yes, Abraham and Isaac. Yeah. Verse 10 continuing. Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. Okay. Go on in. Questions? Or sorry, what do you, anything grab your attention in that section?
Jacob blessed Pharaoh.
Yes.
Twice.
Yes. And we know how significant that blessing is, because there's a little story not too far back where Jacob steals the blessing from Isaac. So this is not that sort of end of life blessing where you're passing on literally your entire estate to your child sort of thing, but it is significant to receive a blessing from someone who's been blessed by God. And so that is very significant, and that it's repeated. I always say this is something to remember when we get into Romans. When a rabbi repeats themselves, pay attention. That's a rabbinical way of emphasizing something. Yeah. What else?
I think, and I may be lapsing in memory on this.
Mhm.
The fact that Jacob blesses the Pharaoh, knowing that the Pharaoh isn't a believer
Mhm.
of his God,
Mm-hmm.
is really profound to me. I think that's
Yes.
the grace shown there. Like, I put myself in that position of, would I bless somebody who's blaspheming my Lord? I don't know.
Well, and what's interesting, of course, we're not, the commandments haven't been given yet. There's no first commandment yet, right?
Mhm.
And we even see at places like when Jacob is leaving Laban after the years of service and this kind of stuff, he at a certain point says to everyone in his entourage, "Okay, put away your household gods, no more of that." Meaning that in his own family were lots of people worshiping people
Yeah,
worshiping
true,
gods
right.
besides Yahweh, right? And the group that started with Genesis knows one of the things scholars are a little divided on when it comes to Abraham is, was he a henotheist or was he a monotheist? Okay, so a henotheist is someone who only worships one God, but believes in lots of others. And of course, a monotheist only believes there is one God. Okay? And what that essentially means is they really only believe there's one God and then lots of other pretenders to the throne. Okay? Interestingly enough, of course, this language isn't invented till the 19th century. It's the 1800s when scholars have to have a category. Because what they're trying to do in the wake of the Enlightenment is retain Christian, what they view as the value parts of Christianity, but dispense with actual religious belief. So they come up with this category, we believe in one God, but that works just as well for if you're an Enlightenment, what's the word, deist. You can believe in one God. You have a category. Now I'm an inheritor of the Christian tradition without being a Christian anymore, right? And so scholars are sort of debate back and forth. Did Abraham believe there was only one God, or did he believe in all these other gods, but he only worshipped one, and that's what makes him the father of faith. He worships Yahweh. This gets more complicated by the fact that in Hebrew, the word Elohim is equally applied to angels, God, and human beings. All of us. It means essentially spirit. Okay, and what makes God God is that he's the spirit, El. Okay, Elohim is plural. Okay, so yeah, so it would be very, I'm going to say, natural, normal, in a sort of pantheistic worldview, like Hinduism today. There's gods in everything. You know, a really pious Buddhist or Hindu might pray for the gods in the grains of rice that they're eating, okay, and give thanks. So the world's impregnated with spiritual entities all around us, and Abraham might have believed there was only really one sort of top one, and everyone would have believed that in some way. The fact that he only worshipped that one and didn't worship the ones that his father did and made all those idols was really
Makes it much
significant.
easier to understand why he
Yeah.
did that.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that was a rabbit chase.
We do. That's why we go slow. No, that's why we go slow. No, don't be sorry. That is what we do in this group. It's why Deacon Michael can get through the Bible in a year, and we've been, what, a year and a half in Genesis? It's been a while. It's been a while. Yeah, we're going for sort of depth on one particular book at this point. Any other questions or any other ideas that struck you in that section?
I thought when you were saying about them feeling a little intimidated by all the Hebrews arriving, and I don't want to get political, but
Sure.
we had this same conversation recently. We were reading Exodus, and I was saying I kind of feel like that when you see the number of Muslims coming, and that kind of fear that can be like, well, if Muslims come from here and here and here, and before you know, you hear, oh, it's going to be Sharia law here, but that fear stirs up in you. Now, as Christians, we're like, this is an opportunity. These Muslims are going to be around us. We can go to the park with their kids. We can, it's ultimately as a Christian how we view it, or how we,
Right.
but we related that when we were reading Exodus and understanding how they could go from being, given this wonderful land to becoming slaves.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's an intentional move on the part of Pharaoh as Exodus begins, where he says, look at all these people. They could turn against it. They haven't. They could.
Right.
Let's make sure they don't have the opportunity. Right? Yeah. And so it's very natural, sort of territorial thinking that characterizes, I think, humanity in general. You're right, as Christians especially, but even that sort of, to carry it back to what you said about how him blessing someone who's a pagan worshiper, and it changes throughout Egyptian history and the different dynasties and different kingdoms. But in all likelihood, the Pharaoh is seen as the instantiation of the top god. You know, he's almost God in the flesh. Okay, certainly a child at least of Ra. He's considered that Ra takes his place within him, and that way of thinking that he would give a blessing to him. One of the things we talked extensively about regarding the Nephilim and the falls of the angels and stuff earlier in Genesis is that what God is going to do through Abraham's seed is go out and claim all the nations for himself. That he originally gave out at the Tower of Babel incident to all these other Elohim, to use the correct word in Hebrew, right? We would think of them as angels. He gives them charge over these nations, and they betray him by accepting worship for themselves. And so he's going to go out and reclaim all of them. That's actually really the significance in the Gospels. We're not going to do a Gospel this year, but when we get into the Gospels, when at, I think it's Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus stands upon the pagan shrine of Pan, the god of all. You can tell the word Pan means like pantheism, like all the world, right? He stands at that shrine and claims everything for himself. He's claiming to be Yahweh. It's like a coded way of saying it, but he's also putting the spiritual forces on notice. I'm here to take back my own, thank you very much.
So I missed the one on the Nephilim.
Yeah.
You can watch them there on YouTube.
Yeah, they're all streamed to YouTube, so. Yeah.
I would love to hear that discussion.
I'll pass you along to a guy named Michael Heiser, who was the scholar who's most of. I was drawing on a lot of his scholarship to teach that section. So yeah. Okay. So yeah, but that's really what we see here. This blessing of others, and that's why God works through Abraham to begin with. He wants to bless all peoples, right? He wants to bless all peoples, and we see this in small forms in the New Testament, growing and growing and growing until finally we have Christ, and Christ literally claims, especially at his ascension, is going to say, how are you going to spread the gospel, right? Jerusalem, Judea, so the southern kingdom, going beyond that, and then finally out to all the world. You know, you're going to it's like throwing that ring in the pond, and the ring's going to reach the whole end of the pond eventually. So, all right. Let's pick up at verse 13. So we're gonna fly now. So we get through all this. These guys know we would normally go for another 20 minutes. 13. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So what's happening? This is geopolitics at a high level.
They sold themselves.
Yeah, in the end, that's what they end up doing. But first, they give literally all their resources in, right? Just to keep alive, they're pouring all their resources into Pharaoh's account, right? What is this doing? This famine is having the effect of what in terms of Egypt's power?
It's growing.
Yeah, it's consolidating it, absolutely. You know, when we talked about, where's that map here? So on this map, you know, when they're saying there's this massive famine, it's this whole area here, right? So what that means is here's the biggest empire in the world next to Egypt, or actually it's larger than Egypt, up here in the Assyrian Empire. It can't come down through, has to go through all this land, it has to provision itself because it can't get any supplies coming in. So they're temporarily protected from invasion. And in the meantime, while they're probably getting poorer, because we're not sure how far up this particular famine stretched. We do know, obviously we can tell it was caused by lack of rain, right? This is not atypical. Drought is the major cause of famine in the ancient world. You got all this politics going on here. They're getting more and more powerful in the meantime. And specifically, Pharaoh is gaining power because he has now all the riches of land. And now they become what we would think of in the American colonial period as indentured servants. They're selling themselves, their lives, in exchange for what they need. Usually in the American experience, it was for travel to the new land, and you become a servant because of that. But essentially now they're really even giving up what they would have possessed as rights as citizens for the sake of just living and eating. Yeah.
We didn't establish whether during the 7 years of plenty, the people were paid for the grain, did we?
We know that they were taxed for a certain portion of it. They would have eaten some, saved some for seed, and some of it would have gone into the granaries,
But not
to be saved.
Not paid.
They wouldn't have paid for that, no, because they were growing it themselves.
It's just taxed.
Yeah, they were just taxed for it, right. But not unlike what happens in many crises, and people are talking about this in the West right now. There's a sociologist or economist out of California. I got onto his material about 1.5 years ago, who's saying we're essentially recreating the medieval ages worldwide right now, because what you have is some people at the very top continuing to get richer and richer, while people below a certain line are growing materially poorer, or at least have less political influence than they ever had before, even if their material circumstances. So essentially you get as a serf class with no influence, and an elite class that doesn't have to listen to anyone else. So he's like, that kind of looks like medieval Europe. That may not have been but it's kind of worldwide, because the way the internet makes us interact has changed the way our monies flow. I mean, we all know Google. You can't miss it. It's like Google and Apple are the two largest companies even in the world, because I just saw news yesterday that Berkshire Hathaway just crossed over into $1 trillion, and they've been there for a long time. So what you have is these people who were smart college students in the early 90s are now controlling most of the commerce in the world. 90% of the world's searches go through Google in every country. That's a lot of control for one company to have. So what you're seeing here is that while the country is being desolated by this ongoing thing, and they're being preserved from true death, at the meantime, the poor have now become essentially slaves, and Pharaoh has become all powerful in many ways. So.
Seems to show that nothing's new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun.
There's the whole thing with COVID and how there's a people in their desperation are willing to sell securities, sell everything they need in order to survive, and so it's no different from what's actually
It's
happening.
really no different. I thought about COVID, but you're right, that's probably the best example, because in a heartbeat, people started doing things they never would have done because they thought their health was being threatened, right? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Anything else? All right, verse 20. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvests you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So what grabs your attention here?
Yeah, stood out to me. I've got the NIV version in front of me. I've got my Bible, which is ESV. But the fact that here it describes it as it said, the land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. And really, in a way, just the power that's given, that Joseph has, and he's using that power. It's not a good picture of Pharaoh, I mean, of Joseph in a way, when you think, like, by modern standards, we think of, like, the Christian attitude, but this is really putting a lot of power in Joseph's hand, and he's, you know, and he's not doing really, he's not being gracious and kind with it, he's kind of
Well,
doing
he-
it for Pharaoh, it seems.
Well, actually, what he does is establish a 20% marginal tax rate,
Mhm, right, yeah.
which is actually fairly low
Mhm.
compared to what we live with.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so, but yeah, but there's been no concept in the ancient world of anything remotely like democracy. I mean, don't forget, even the first experiments in democracy in Athens are 1,700 years in the future at this point. You know,
Yeah.
so there's always a sense in which the reason why people say God save the king or God save the queen or whatever is because the whole sensibility of what it means to be us as a people is wrapped up in that one figurehead, and it's there. It later would become the concept of noblesse oblige, much later. But there was really a sense in which, as it went with the king or queen, so it went with all the people. And so there was no sense that we should reserve power away from that person because, well, after all, it is Ra in human clothing, right? Or whatever, the son of Ra, we'll give it to him, you know? Yeah, so Pharaoh's, I mean, Joseph is actually, by establishing this tax rate, is actually dealing with a fair amount of fairness towards the people compared to what they might have had in like Assyria or something like that. I would actually need to do research to find out if we even know that. We know a lot more about Hammurabi much later. But.
Right, that's what I was thinking about with the Code of Hammurabi, and even throughout Genesis, how often the characters are praised for their shrewdness and their for sagacity rather than for their kindness. I'm just thinking, contrast that with Jesus of, give them your, if somebody asks for your shirt, give them your coat cloak as well. That it's a different world. You very well get.
Yeah, we are not there yet.
We're not there yet. Very, very
we are not there
clear.
yet. Yes. And it might have even been considered a blessing for Joseph to be dealing so fairly with people that, if you want to say, hadn't earned it, right? Yeah.
Did he deal fairly with everyone else?
Well, he seems to have, and
Yeah.
that's why he was ultimately raised.
He seems to see himself more as an Egyptian, I think, though, than
He might by this
Hebrew.
point.
because,
Yeah, he might.
he
by this
seems like separated from the Hebrews.
Yeah. Although he does seem to not worship the Egyptian gods.
Right.
And he would definitely be, if you went to see Joseph at this point, he's gonna be dressed like an Egyptian with the eye makeup and the whole 9 yards. He would not look like a Hebrew in that way. Yeah.
Well, it would be, that would be the same as Moses, that Moses was raised as an Egyptian, so he
Yes.
looked weird to the Hebrews when he came to them.
When they, yep, exactly, yep, 100%. Yeah, another really significant thing to think about this, one of the things that sort of modern or liberal, however you want to say it, scholarship since the mid-1800s is when it really all gets kicked off, although it goes back to the late 1700s, is to say, and much of modern scholarship period in all fields is really influenced by Marxism, okay? And Marxism, with one of its lines is, the only dividing line morally is not generosity, it's oppressed oppressor. That's the categories used to parse every moral interaction. Well, what has been a large part of what's called liberation theology has been to say, well, this Genesis passage, what it is and what the whole of the Exodus passages is just the Jews trying to establish their right to the land. So that's the way these stories are written. These 7 verses we just read here from 20 to 26, it would be a weird way of justifying your history, because some people didn't even believe that the Exodus happened at all. They were digging in the wrong place. That's another whole thing. That's been pretty well inverted in the last 20 years. That's not really going to carry much water anymore. But when I went to seminary, there were a lot of people who believed it, and a lot of professors who at least introduced us to that idea, if they didn't advocate for it. It would be a really strange justification of your land to put some of the internal politics of Egypt into it, and how their priests, the Egyptian priests, didn't have to give up their land. It's just a weird fact to include it. If you're just writing something to say, we're entitled to this, and this is our history, why include all that information? The Jews are really good about including information that does not flatter them and does not justify them. And it attests to the actual historicity of these documents, huh?
To the truth of it, then.
To the truth of it, exactly. That this is real history being recounted, not us trying to make up or rewrite history, as so often happens in history period, but especially in the modern world, it's getting more and more that way. Please forget what I said yesterday, only pay attention to what I'm saying today. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. Moving on at 27, we'll finish up the chapter. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, of course Israel is the other name for Joseph, or Jacob rather, excuse me. When the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh, and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, Swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. Okay. What grabs your attention now?
How important it is that Jacob goes home.
Yes. Yeah, it's very important. They are sojourners in Egypt, but their homeland is Canaan.
And they use the word sojourn, the definition of sojourn, they use that word.
100%. Yes. And of course, the author of Hebrews, who some people think was Paul, and I think it was Apollo. That's all right. The author of Hebrews, it's not signed, uses that language of sojourner again, and that's how we're to, Nancy, to your point before, it's how we're to regard ourselves as Christians. We're sojourners in this land. Even though I might be a proud American or a proud Italian American or whatever it is, I'm just a sojourner here. My real homeland is elsewhere. Yeah, and we're always to remember that from generation to generation. Ultimately, Jacob will not be returned to Canaan until the Exodus. Joseph's going to make this promise, but I love that they included that little snippet, the whatever it was, 1948 version of the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston or whatever year that was. They show as they're leaving Egypt, you see them carrying Jacob's body. They're carrying it in state. They're returning him to probably the cave at Machpelah where Abraham is buried. Yeah.
So if Joseph made the promise, then I mean, it's interesting that in Genesis ends he hasn't done that. Obviously, he does eventually go. I mean, we know that kind of the end of the story, but it is. Is there any thought as to why Joseph doesn't have it done immediately?
Well, right now they can't travel. I mean, that it's going to be
Of course,
with the famine, you're not going to travel. Yeah. So that would be why it didn't happen immediately. Why it didn't happen in his lifetime, hard to know. Affairs of state or whatever, right? But yeah. Again, one of the things they have found when they dug in the right place, or actually at the right depth, is what the issue is. When they dug in the right depth, is that they found a set of clearly what are burial, not plots, but houses, right, in the Egyptian style. Basically mini pyramids, but inside they were decorated in Canaanite rather than in Egyptian. And there's 12 of them, oddly enough. And one big one at the center, which could have been for Joseph, but also could have been for Jacob. One larger one. So that's one of the things they've discovered, which is quite interesting in Goshen. And this goes back to why, for those of us who remember that older version, sorry, you're not old enough for that version of the movie, but if you remember, what was the Pharisee's name? Pharaoh's name. Pharaoh's name. It's not Pharisee, Pharaoh's. The Pharaoh's name, who is supposed to be Moses' half-brother. Who is that? It's Ramses. If you noticed earlier in this chapter, it talked about in the land of Ramesses. This is why they were digging at the wrong level. Because they went to, when was Ramesses? When was he Pharaoh? We'll start digging there to look for the evidence of the Hebrews in the Exodus. And then also in Exodus it talks about the city of Ramesses. So what a really smart guy figured out, and he's not a trained he loves Egyptology, but it's his hobby. He's actually a record producer. He made all his money producing pop records that went multi-platinum in Europe and America. So he had his own money to dig with, and he didn't need to ask for handouts from Harvard or any place else. He said, you know what? You don't really name things you don't name things after people till they're dead. So if there's a land of Ramesses and a cities of Ramesses, Ramesses must have been long dead. We must be digging at the wrong level. Let's go 200 years later. And that's where they found all this stuff. So just a little factoid to go into that, which I think is kind of cool. It's still being disputed, obviously, because, well, dispute is what academics do. It's what they do for a living. But there's way a lot of evidence in his favor now that's kind of overwhelming, and all these theories that dominated for about 150 years before this are kind of falling apart pretty quickly. So that's interesting. Anything else about this section before we start chapter 48?
I was intrigued by the put your hand under my thumb.
Yes, I wondered if someone was going to bring that up. This is why we don't have young kids in this Bible study. So that's a sort of Hebrew way of being bashful and saying what they were actually doing. He was actually holding onto his groin. Another thing that scholars of Hebrew or scholars of the Hebrew scriptures debate about is, at what point did people start to believe in life after death? Because the the Sadducees in Jesus' day didn't believe in it. You lived for however many years you lived in this life, then you died and you were gone. They did not believe in life after death. So there are some modern Jews who do not believe in life after death. Obviously you see in the Psalms, Sheol and stuff like this. So the book of Psalms is part of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures that the Sadducees wouldn't have used. They only used the 5 books of Moses. Okay, as we just saw one of our favorite episodes of although they were Samaritans in that, and our favorite episodes of The Chosen. The book of Psalms and all the prophets and all that stuff, the Pharisees were using, but the Sadducees weren't. Okay, in of course the book of Psalms you see this concept of Sheol, which is the place of the dead. Okay. It looks a lot like the Greek place of the dead. It's not heaven or hell, it's just where dead people go. Okay, it's just where you're sort of in that place. The heaven and hell concept becomes clarified by Jesus much later. So this concept of, did they believe in life after death or not? What you were doing by holding onto somebody's groin is you were holding onto their eternal life, because it was through their seeds, through their genetics, through their children and grandchildren and whatever, that they had life moving forward, if you didn't believe in this. So it was a way of doing a really solemn oath. Okay? I swear upon your posterity, I swear to your children's children, this thing.
So this was more than a pinky swear. Got it.
This is more than a pinky swear, you got it. Yeah, well, because you're saying basically, I'm taking your life in my hands, quite literally. Okay, yes.
Super glad notaries.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's why they
Well,
invented,
that's embarrassing.
that is why they invented notaries, yeah, there you go. Yeah. And this is also why it would be okay to fulfill that promise in a future generation, because the promise is really to his posterity that this will happen. So, yeah. Okay. Anything else grab you there?
Actually, in a way that just struck out how beautiful it is, though, that this leads us right into Exodus, and that the story continues, that it's meant to be that way. And it's really awesome.
Okay. Moving on to chapter 48. We're flying. Audio Bible.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. So, no, I'll let you figure that out. Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And now your 2 sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Padan To my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. So what grabs your attention here?
In some places using the name Jacob
Mm-hmm.
and then using the name Israel.
Yes.
And who is,
Mhm. Why would they do that? Why would the narrator do that?
Israel summoned his strength.
Mhm.
Are we thinking more the nation there?
It's a deliberate play.
Yeah.
So he goes back. They go back and forth between those names, right? Jacob when it's more personal, and Israel when it's meant to at least invoke in us some thought about his progeny and
Right,
who the
right.
nation it would become. Yeah, yeah. Interestingly enough, the New Testament does that intentionally. All through the New Testament uses the word Lord, which would have been reserved, which has been the Hebrew way of saying God's name, right? You don't say Yahweh if you're a Hebrew because you get stoned. You say Lord. So when you're reading aloud from the Torah, when you see the tetragram, which is the 4 letters of Yahweh, you go Adonai. You just say, or if that's Greek too. Sorry, that is Hebrew. That's the Greek translation of Hebrew. Never mind. Anyway, my brain's getting confused. Yeah, you just say Adonai out loud. You say Lord, Lord, Lord. Well, 9 times out of 10 in the New Testament that refers to Jesus, and that's deliberate, so that when we hear Lord Jesus, we think Yahweh Jesus. So yeah, it's an old Hebrew trick. It's not a new thing in the New Testament. It's a trick. It's a Hebrew way of expressing yourself. The same way that some poets will use a word that deliberately means 2 things to make you think both at the same time. It's a Hebrew way of telling the story.
I was caught by the, he talks about how the land will be fruitful, make a community of peoples, and then that'll be everlasting possession. But
Yes.
yet it's not. Not in the physical way of it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's going to get into a lot of theology later, but the reality is that that's why once they actually took over the land, they thought they were impregnable. They thought they would be, we can do whatever we want. God won't hold us to account for it, and so consequently, the northern kingdom collapses right after the death of Solomon, and a few decades later, a few 100 years later, actually, the southern kingdom collapses, and you end up with the exiles and all this kind of stuff going on. Is because they thought that meant they were unaccountable to God, because God promised it. It's going to be there. That's why they thought they were undefeatable if they carried the ark into battle. They detached their faithfulness to God from God's promises, even though Joshua will warn them not to do that as they enter the land. And of course, the way we as Christians understand the everlasting inheritance is that because Christ remember your time before about how the king embodies the fate of the whole nation? Well, Jesus is, when we say Christ is king, like a Christ the King Sunday in our church tradition, you're saying that he embodies everything. All the promises made to Israel now apply to all of us, even as Gentiles, and all the nations of the world. So the everlasting inheritance is the whole earth. The earth belongs to Christ, who is Yahweh in the flesh now. So the promise is there, and it's sustained, but it changes. It changes from this physical land to everything being applied. So yeah, good catch.
So I have a question with the whole thing with Ephraim and Manasseh. There's obviously no tribe of Joseph in the 12th tribe. It becomes the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Manasseh.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yep. And that's what he's doing. He's saying he's making Ephraim and Manasseh his children in the same way that Reuben and Jude and
Isn't there a way to double the blessings of Joseph because of what he did for saving the people? Like, is it something like that? Is there significance to it like
Yes.
that? Or?
Yeah, I think there probably is. I don't know for sure, but that would make sense. Because he doesn't say, Joseph, your inheritance will be X, Y, or Z, right? He gives it to his children directly. Yeah. And he claims Ephraim and Manasseh as his own. He says that all their children are yours. So, I mean, they all trace their line back to Joseph, but it's not going to become a point of pride. To this day, we don't say they don't say the children of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.
Joseph.
Right.
It's always Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob,
Yeah.
or the way you respond to, or the way you characterize or title the people of Jewish origin. And by extension, us with the promises. We'll study in Romans. Anyway.
But it's so interesting because when you think about the fact that Joseph was Jacob's beloved, that there is no tribe of Joseph, you feel like he's just lost to history. If you don't know the book of Genesis, but you know the 12 tribes, like, so who's this Joseph guy? You know,
Yeah.
he's so important, but then you get this, like, the 2 children.
Absolutely. And particularly the tribe of Manasseh will be a mess. From the very beginning, they will be a mess, unfortunately. So. Anything else grab your attention there?
Why does the whole thing of bringing up Rachel and the whole experience of it on the road to Ephraim?
Because he will not be buried with Rachel, and that's going to be a grief to him. Because Rachel was his favorite wife.
Right.
Yeah. Rachel was the wife he wooed for in the first place. Ended up with Leah because Laban tricked him. And then you get that so many of the children come from their 2 servant ladies who are given to him as wives as well by them because they're competing with each other. So Rachel and Leah are competing for the status in the household. Human beings compete naturally for status. It's a natural part of who we seem to be as human beings. Guys compete for it with physical strength and beating each other up. Women have different ways of going at that with each other. So Rachel and Leah are competing for status in the household. But Rachel is clearly the more fragile of the 2 of them. She has less children, takes longer to have the children, seems to be physically, and she dies first of all the 4 of them. So. Anything else? One more final thing I'll note, and we'll end it here for today because we're almost to noon. The little, probably there is a parentheses in an English translation, that is Bethlehem, right? Ephrath is the same as Bethlehem. So again, something that scholars debate about because dissertations need to be written, an article need to be written, is who actually wrote the 5 books of Moses. So, and I apologize, this is kind of old hat for you guys, but why would people think that maybe, they're called the books of Moses by everyone, why would people think that maybe Moses didn't actually write them? Yeah, there's no written language that we know of at the time of Moses.
It records Moses' death.
And Moses' death is actually recounted, yes. Most people don't write about their own deaths, no matter how good they are. Right? So that's why there would be scholars saying this was clearly written later. It's also the nature of the Hebrew. A tag like that would be another reason people would say that, because it needs to be called Bethlehem by the time it's important to write. That's Bethlehem if you don't know what Ephrath is, right? If it was Ephrath back when it was written, that's what you would just call it and leave it at. Okay. So we've talked about this as a group. First of all, the Bible is full of books that some people think are what they call pseudepigrapha. So I hand out fancy words in here. Sorry about that. I know Amanda was teaching Greek in here before I came in, or at least
Did not
Greek
use that
history. So obviously pseudo, most of us know what that means. Quasi kind of like. Grapha means to be written, and the die in the middle, dopi, is more just for connecting, but essentially means writing in the name of somebody else. Okay, so you're purposely writing using and signing someone else's name to it. This is debatably New Testament as well as Old Testament practice, and it's not, unlike what Bart Ehrman would like to make you think, it is not meant to be someone pulling the wool over your eyes. They're not trying to trick you. I train in karate. Sorry I bring it up a lot, but it's my hobby. One of the things I just proofread for my sensei is a booklet he's handing out to everybody at the beginning of training for this year. And in it, he mostly talks about his teachers. And it's a way of showing honor to the person who came before you, to be known in their name. I'm continuing the thought of so-and-so. This is not meant to be what we would call plagiarism today, or falsification of your name and stuff. It was known about practice. It wasn't new, okay? But in addition to pseudepigrapha, there's also what's called redaction, which is just a fancy word for editing. This is also acceptable practice. It was not considered altering the book to fix grammatical errors, to include material that the original author didn't know about. You were just building on it, and you didn't change the name of it, okay? Now, what they have discovered, again, it's like everything being debated, is that there probably was actually writing at the time of Moses, but it would have been much more primitive than the Hebrew we have today, okay? They have some evidences of it. They've got extant stuff. But obviously, language evolves. Language changes. I know you're doing, we were talking about this before class, they're doing Midsummer Night's Dream as the first Shakespeare play in your class for the year, because they're doing it down at the Sales University a couple weeks from now. Well, in it, there's a guy who's called an ass the whole way through. And of course it makes everyone laugh, just like it made you laugh. At the time of the King James, which is when this is being written, it means a donkey. Okay? It doesn't mean what we think of as somebody's behind, which is why the King James translation talks about Balaam's ass. It wasn't made to make you giggle in church. It was made to make you think of a donkey. It eventually became slang for people's behind because you were being as stubborn as that, and you were making yourself an idiot. Okay, so that's why they title it that way. So the language changed in 500 years. That still means something, but now it's like a second or third bullet point under the definition, right? Well, the same way, Hebrew is going to change with time. So what you had probably was Moses writing these original accounts, and then later people, without changing the authorship, they're still calling it the Book of Moses, he's the writer. But they're adding things to make it understandable for the modern audience who's reading this stuff 500 years or 700 years after Moses. That doesn't mean they're falsifying Moses' account. Where would they get the details about what happened with the priests and who got whose land if it wasn't from Moses, right? There's still, that material is there. It's just being added to keep it so that people can understand it. It's the same thing we do with English translations today. Why one translating committee chooses this word and another translation committee chooses that word to translate the exact same stuff, because they think it'll speak better to their audience and help people understand the stories. The stories are what's important, not to be so granular with the words, although the words are important too, because that's how you tell the stories, okay? So just to throw that out there, redaction means editing, pseudepigraphy means writing in somebody else's name. Both were practices that would have been common in the ancient world. There's debates about how much of this appears in the Bible, but certainly redaction does. We can see where, for instance, the Gospel of John originally ended, and one of John's disciples tagged something after it. That doesn't mean he was changing John's Gospel. It was probably material that was earlier, and he wanted to end the Gospel in a different way. Okay? Doesn't mean it's not the Word of God. The content is what makes it the Word of God, not how we got the text we have in front of us today. Okay? All right. Thank you all.